Our next reader was born in Moscow, USSR, in 1970. He immigrated to the U.S. with his family in 1978 and got in trouble in first grade for doodling on his Lenin Red Star pin and hasn't stopped doodling since. After a false start at Parsons School of Design in New York, he graduated with a BFA in painting and printmaking from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1993. Upon graduation, he promptly began driving a cab, first in Boston, then after a time in Chicago, which eventually led to the publication of his illustrated work memoir, Hack, Stories from a Chicago Cab, by the University of Chicago Press in 2011. And the forthcoming, actually it's out now, it's no longer forthcoming, it's out, correct? There's a stack right there. Where to? A Hack Memoir from Curbside Splendor. He has exhibited his work in all manner of bars, coffee shops, libraries, and even the odd gallery when he's really hard up. He paints and writes here in Chicago, in Beverly, actually. Any Southsiders? Come on, represent. All right, never mind. And he no longer drives a cab. Please give a warm welcome to Dmitry Samarov.
Good? I think so. Loud enough? Too loud? Okay. All right. I'm going to read two short pieces out of this new book, and it's all about experiences from behind the wheel. So it's pretty self-explanatory, but two different types of people that I drove around. This first one's called Incentive Fare. Position this thing so I can actually read. Okay. From 2004 to 2008, most of my afternoons started with a trip to Back of the Yards. Named for the Union Stockyards, which famously made the city hog butcher to the world until they were shuttered in the early 70s, it's not the most posh neighborhood in Chicago. Boarded up houses and young men hanging around corners eyeing passersby are commonplace. But as in most economically troubled parts of town, there's much more that happens without garnering much notice. St. Rosa's School at 49th and Hoyne brought me there. The Regional Transit Authority, which regulates handicap vans and other transport options for the developmentally disabled teenagers and adults, contracted Chicago cab companies to handle some of the work the vans couldn't handle. It was called the Mobility Direct Program. Many more people waited for rides to and from home than they could handle. Unlike regular cab rides, these were flat rates determined by the length of the trip. Most were either $13 or $21. The passengers were also required to give the driver the cost of a bus or train ride in cash. At the end of the ride, the driver would key in a drop-off code into the Gandalf terminal and be paid out by the company's cashier a day later. It was steady, predictable business, worthwhile on slow weekday afternoons. St. Rosa's is one of the places in Chicago where the developmentally disabled spend their days. Some of these places are church-run, others city-run, and what goes on inside varies. I never went any further than the vestibules or waiting areas, and only heard about the activities therein from my passengers. Some described jobs assembling products. Others described what basically sounded like daycare. The degree of their mental and physical disability varied greatly as well. Unlike so many of the people I drove around day in and day out, they absolutely needed these rides. And that made me feel like my job was occasionally a bit more than just chauffeuring the bored and the drunk about town. A skinny black girl in her early 20s always made me put on WGCI, her ride home to the West Side. I heard R. Kelly's Trapped in the Closet for the first time during one of these rides. I thought it was a put-on, a comedy skit, but she knew every word and sang along without any irony. This was the thing that I appreciated most about her and many of the others in this program, the lack of irony in the way they took in their world. Many passengers were barely verbal, but there was no mistaking whether they'd had a good or a bad day. Sometimes it was as simple as a smile of recognition as they got into the cab, as opposed to the refusal to make any eye contact. The impediments they were born with often robbed them of the ability to hide their emotions, at least in front of a stranger like me. I remember one guy complaining the whole way home about someone who was picking on him at St. Rose's. I never learned how the problem started, or even the tormentor's name, but the feeling of being wronged couldn't be clearer. After getting out of the cab, he continued his argument all the way to his front door. The prospect of going to the south and west sides of Chicago to pick up handicapped passengers wasn't always that enticing to checker drivers. Many of these passengers occasionally had to wait an hour or longer to be picked up. So to remedy this, the company created an incentive fare competition. Each month, the drivers who picked up the most fares that had been waiting half an hour or longer would win money. The contest applied to any kind of fare that stayed on the board a while, but every month a large chunk came from the Mobility Direct program. Some drivers didn't want to go anywhere but downtown or the airports. Others were put off by having to deal with the disabled. So the contest encouraged them to go outside of their comfort zones a bit. Every month, though, the same names would appear on the winners list, posted next to the cashier's window. Checker cab number 5999 always won the top $250 prize. 3 or 4 guys, including me, usually fought over the second $150 prize. Some months I'd actively try to unseat 5999, but I never came close, even with a tally of up to 60 to 70 rides in the month. His cab had tinted windows and other custom detailing. He obviously owned it and wasn't a renter like me. But I never talked to him or found out his secret to always snagging first place in our little contest. Was it altruism or just a sharpened sense of competition that drove him? Or the rest of us, for that matter? Was it wrong to profit from our customers' need? When Checker was swallowed by Yellow Cab, the incentive fares disappeared. The Mobility Direct program continued, but seemed to be much reduced. I no longer found myself by the viaduct on Hoyne just north of St. Rose's every afternoon, waiting for 2:30 p.m., when the center would empty for the day, its occupants streaming out of the front doors to the waiting sedans, handicapped vans, and taxis. Driving a cab felt a little less worthwhile after taking the disabled kids was no longer part of my regular routine. So there's that. Now for, as they say, for something completely different. So I'll give you a little bit of the range of the job and the kind of people you run into. This is called Charles Bronson. No, I didn't drive Charles Bronson. I'm in the 7-Eleven at Wrightwood and Lincoln, buying a snack when 2 young guys approach me. One has a baby face with puffy cheeks and curly hair. The other's scruffier, attempting some sort of facial hair. They're both buying blunts. "That you?" the scruffy one asks, pointing to the cab out front. "Know where LaSalle Power Company is?" They both want to know. I know where it is. It's one of a couple dozen gigantic, indistinguishable bars in River North. At one time, it was a location of Michael Jordan's restaurant. "How long will it take?" "We're not from around here. We're from Notre Dame. By the way, what do you think of Charles Bronson?" Being asked by a 20-year-old about the Star of Deathwish kind of throws me. I tell him that I think Bronson's pretty cool. "You see, I think Charles Bronson is pretty much the greatest. When I was little, my dad used to always say, 'Don't mess with Charles Bronson.' So I had to find out who he was. Now I own like 30 of his movies. Did you know that Charles Bronson lost his virginity at 5.5? That's according to Charles Bronson, and I wouldn't dare to question him. He called it making it. Not to be outdone, his friend tells me about the term paper he wrote for his World War II film class. He favored The Great Escape and The Dirty Dozen over Baton, because the latter did not feature Bronson. Charles Bronson smoked cigarettes when he was 6. He only died in one movie, The Mechanic, and that was just so he could prove that he could still kill from beyond the grave. This is like attending a graduate level seminar. They're very devoted. Only once during the ride does conversation stray from Bronson, and that's a brief tangent on what disagreements have caused them to get into fistfights. I punched a kid in the face because he said Creed was lame. Because they're not. They're awesome, the curly one says. I chipped this dude's tooth because he accused me of having Nickelback on my iPod. What the difference is, I don't know. Outside the LaSalle Power Company were one of a half dozen other taxis, limos, and valet vehicles clogging up the block. When was the last time you saw a Charles Bronson film, and what's your favorite, sir? The curly one wants to know. I'm not sure how to answer. May I suggest Death Wish 4, The Crackdown? It's a particular favorite. I thank him for the tip and watch as they get out of the cab and make their way to the back of the velvet rope line, waiting to get into the bar. It's heartening to know that the younger generation hasn't forgotten about the heroes of the past. Thank you.